Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this, the third part in the Ernie Clarke arc. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, please do so before proceeding with this one. At the end of the last instalment, I discussed how Ernie Clarke had lost his appeal against his conviction, yet there was a glimmer of hope when the BBC series Rough Justice took an interest in the case. Join me as I discuss their investigation and its aftermath. Having lost his right to appeal, Clarke remained in prison, and by 1983 he was residing in the cells of Wakefield, still protesting his innocence, and his protestations would be taken into consideration by the BBC television series Rough Justice, who also assisted in the case of Alan Livesey, the teenager found murdered in his own home, a death his mother, Margaret, was convicted of. But when Clarke's case was brought before the Rough Justice team, they did not believe there was anything to substantiate the claims of innocence. Reading the files, they found that Clarke had been open about his association with Eileen, and the primary witness against him, namely his former co-worker Mr. Embleton, seemed to have no incentive to lie. Furthermore, there lacked any further avenues to explore. There was no crime scene or forensic evidence. It appeared there was nothing more to explore. One man, Mr. Tom Sargent, who had brought the case to their attention, was adamant that Clarke was not guilty and urged the team to reconsider their decision not to proceed. As an incentive, he provided them with a possible point of inquiry. He theorised that the murder may have been committed by a sailor. Given that multiple vessels visited the site, they would have easy access to the Velva Liquids complex where the body had been found. And if they had been there on several occasions, perhaps they would have been familiar with its layout. Tom Sargent convinced the team to at least look into the shipping records to see what vessels were on the Tyne around the time of Eileen's disappearance, in January 1970. Although still sceptical that they would be able to find anything of substance, the team proceeded, but came up with nothing of interest. Nor did they have much luck when reviewing the police files. The findings within them they concurred with, after conducting their own inquiries into the movements of Eileen and Clarke. One individual who may have been a potential suspect was Eileen's former boyfriend, Graham Atkins, who worked as a fireman, so he probably wouldn't have had an issue with climbing a ladder while carrying a body. He was also the last person to have seen the 17-year-old alive. But beyond these factors, they couldn't connect him to the Velva site. The team's suspicion against Graham was lessened further when they interviewed him and found that despite several years passing between the body being found and them talking to him, Graham's accounts of the events remained consistent. Ruling him out as an alternate suspect, the team returned to the files, combing through them to find the smallest discrepancy, or an unresolved lead. One instance they came across was the recovery of a knife from Clarke's home in Hull. This kitchen implement had been secured at the same time as his arrest, but after being entered into evidence, the Rough Justice team could find no further mention of it, and after looking into the matter, they drew the conclusion that the police had likely found that the blade was not relevant. The major breakthrough in the Rough Justice investigation came when they started to look into the various samples of chemicals collected from the Velva site. They noted that 6 samples were required, yet only 4 were submitted for trial as Exhibits 99A, B, C and D. There were 2, 99A and 99D, which were samples of lauryl alcohol, while B and C contained stearyl alcohol. Although these two appeared similar, chemically they were different, but it did not seem as though this had been made clear to the jury at the trial. The question for rough justice was whether the differences between these chemicals had relevance to the case, but they also wondered why the 2 additional samples had not been submitted to the court. Their curiosity was piqued further when they found that the sample labelled number 93 had been recovered from the right channel beneath tank 4, while its counterpart, sample number 94, was retrieved from the left channel. This was significant as these were roughly the areas Clarke had allegedly flooded with the chemicals contained within tank number 4. So any evidence from these sites could prove fundamental, particularly because Eileen's jumper had supposedly been recovered from the left channel encased in the waxy substance formed when the chemical held in the tank cooled. Sample 94, taken from the left channel, was found to be stearyl alcohol, which tallied with the substance that was saturated in the jumper. But why were there also samples of lauryl alcohol? This question led the team on a search for the records of what was being held in the tanks around the time of the murder. It was a task they were sceptical about accomplishing, as most company records are destroyed after 7 years. So it was likely that this had occurred before Eileen's body had been discovered in 1979. Believing these records probably didn't exist, they relied on the memories of individuals who were connected to Velva Liquids. Unfortunately, Leanings, the company who used the site for storing their chemicals, didn't have any paperwork regarding what was stored there and when. Nor could the manager remember what had been at the complex over a decade earlier. They had slightly more success with the foreman of the Velva site, Brian Fennick, the man who had been conducting spot checks on Clarke due to tardiness and a suspicion that Clarke was stealing petrol. Mr. Fennick believed that they had stored lauryl alcohol at the site from February 1968 to September 1968. And at some point after this, stearyl alcohol was being stored. Douglas Moon, the former manager of Velva, had passed away prior to Rough Justice taking up the investigation. Therefore, they spoke to his wife, who had also worked as his secretary in 1979 when the body was found. She recalled being there when detectives interviewed her husband, and remembered he produced records pertaining to what was being held in the tank between 1969 and 1970, with January 1970 being when Eileen went missing. He had given these documents to the officers, however they were not produced at trial. Was this just another example of something being deemed irrelevant, hence why the defence was unaware of the existence of these records? Knowing the police had obtained these records, the team attempted to find them, and to their surprise they were still at the Velva site, amongst various exhibits which, having been taken during the police investigation, had been returned to the company who were the rightful owners. These items had been undisturbed since being returned, to the extent that they were still within their polythene bags with their seals intact. Amongst these evidence bags was also Eileen's torn jumper. Looking at the records, Rough Justice were able to determine that in January 1970, when Eileen disappeared, tank number 4 had been used to store lauryl alcohol, and no stearyl alcohol had been on the site since August 1969. But if lauryl alcohol was in the tank when Eileen disappeared, surely that would have been the chemical which Clarke would have flooded the channel with, and in turn the jumper would have been saturated in it. However, the garment was contaminated by stearyl alcohol. And with the assistance of Dr. Patrick Torsland, a consultant biochemist at Guy's Hospital and a senior toxicologist, Rough Justice was able to establish a better understanding of the differences in the two chemicals. Dr. Torsland would explain, quote, "The alcohols are not interchangeable. They will remain very stable even over the timescale involved in this case, and they are not transmutable into one another," meaning that it was not possible for the jumper to be contaminated with an earlier deposition of the chemical. Dr. Torsland determined, quote, "The jumper could only be in the channel at the time sterile alcohol was poured on it," adding, "It appears to me to have nothing to do with the death of the girl, considering the relative times of the Laurel and sterile components in tank number 4. This was a key breakthrough in the case, as it now cast doubt on whether the jumper had actually belonged to Eileen. As the evidence suggested, it had likely been deposited at the site prior to August 1969, 5 months before she disappeared. But if it wasn't Eileen's, then where had it come from, and was it of any significance? Rough Justice would consider something Clarke had said in court, with him suggesting that the clothing may have been an industrial rag, commonly used on the site to wipe hands and equipment, and they were often thrown to the ground after use. To confirm this was the case, Rough Justice was able to track down the supplier of these rags. They headed to a factory in the West Yorkshire town of Dewsbury called Beaumont's, who sourced old clothing, which was then cut up to create the rags, which were then distributed to various companies throughout the country. For the filming of the BBC programme, they asked one of the employees of the factory to demonstrate how the task of cutting the fabrics was carried out, with her utilising the cutting machine and then laying the item out on the ground. She was then asked to compare it to the one found at the Velva site, and concurred that both had been cut in an almost identical fashion. The jumper, combined with Embleton's claim that Clarke had drained tank 4 at the time of Eileen's disappearance, had been a compelling aspect of the Crown's case. But Rough Justice had been able to disprove this major pillar in their argument. It was a detail which caused Mr. Embleton a great deal of distress upon hearing that the evidence he had provided the court may have been inaccurate, with him stating, "I was shocked because, in all honesty, I thought the police had found a lot more than was actually found under there. In all honesty, I couldn't say when the incidents of the bricking up and running off of wax happened. It's within that period of time," adding, "Time plays funny things on your mind." As they concluded their interview with Mr. Embleton, the shaken man told them, "You know, I always thought the sun was shining when I saw Ernie running off the wax. It was a warm day." If his recollection of the weather that day was correct, it was unlikely to have been on the 19th of January, as the temperature failed to get over 7 degrees Celsius. Following the disclosure of this new information to Mr. Embleton, Ernie's former co-worker became unwell and was forced to take a number of days off work. With regards to the investigation, the Rough Justice team had discredited the evidence pertaining to the jumper. It still didn't categorically prove Clarke's innocence, leading to them delving deeper into Eileen's life in the hopes of learning something new which could point to an alternative scenario. They worked back along the timeline, starting from when 17-year-old Eileen had officially been reported missing to the police, which occurred on Thursday the 22nd of January 1970. Her family had made their own efforts to trace her, but when this failed, her mother filed an official missing persons report. However, it would be concluded by the police in 1979 that it was likely Eileen had died on the day she was last seen, which was the 19th of January, 3 days prior to her being reported missing. And they drew this conclusion as there had been no further sightings of the popular girl in the town after this date. But this was one of the aspects in the case which could not be proven, and with Dr. Ranasinghe, who performed the post-mortem, only able to estimate that the body had likely been placed in the tank sometime between 1970 and 1973, it left open a possibility that she may have died at a later date. However, the question remained, where had Eileen been if no one had seen her? Perhaps if the gaps in the known timeline could be clarified, then maybe it would help answer this conundrum. On Friday, the 16th of January 1970, Eileen returned to South Shields with her brother. and she had assured her siblings she had somewhere to stay that weekend, but did not specify where. She did not go to her family home on the Whiteleys estate, nor her sister's flat at Urford Terrace in the low-top area of the town. However, Eileen was able to change her outfit and leave bags of clothing somewhere, and with her only having half an hour to do so, it was suggested she had gone to a property close to the town centre. That night she had been seen in Latino's nightclub, from where she was seen leaving in the company of a man. This individual was traced, and he confirmed that Eileen had left his home at around 2 a.m. But once again, her movements after that time are a mystery. We do know she was still in the vicinity of the town centre, as later that day she was seen by her mother on King Street. There is another gap between this sighting and the final interaction with Eileen the following morning with her boyfriend Graham, who informed police that the teenager alleged she had been kicked out of where she was staying after turning up at his family home at 2:30 that Sunday morning. The police alongside the prosecution proposed that Eileen had gone to Clarke's house on Anderson Street on Friday the 16th of January, as this was located close to the locations the 17-year-old was last seen, and it was easily a property she could have reached within the half an hour between her seeing her brother and her seeing her siblings. The question was, had she gone there, gotten changed and left her 2 bags of clothing, with the intention of returning that night to sleep at the property? And was it at the home on Anderson Street she had gone to after leaving her male companion's house in the early hours of Saturday morning? Could she have gone back there on the Saturday night, with it being Clarke who had cast her out into the rain, dressed only in jeans and a t-shirt, forcing her to make the 25-minute walk to Graham's house on HS Edward Street? One scenario had been that Clarke had anticipated that Eileen would come back to his home, and so he waited for her, and the killing occurred at his property, with him taking the body to the Velva Liquid site later that day, or at least within 4 days of the murder, in accordance with Dr. Ranasing's estimations. There were issues with this hypothesis. Clarke had 3 young children in the house, thus risking them witnessing the attack or its aftermath. And if he left the body at the home while he went out to work, he would have needed to conceal it, while also trying to get to work as quickly as he could. He was due to start at 7 a.m, the same time Eileen left Graham's house, and it would have taken her at least 25 minutes to get from there to Clarke's home. But would he really have risked being late for his shift on the off chance that she might return to get her belongings, particularly as he was being subjected to random spot checks by the foreman, Brian Fennick? According to the log at Velva Liquids, Clarke was at the complex at 7:30 a.m, as he had noted that as the time he had fired up the boiler. But with him being the only one there between 7 and 2 a.m, is it possible that he forged this time to provide himself with an alibi, or simply cover up for his tardiness? Rough Justice argued that this latter detail was unlikely, as Mr. Embleton would have noticed a discrepancy in the temperature of the tanks when he started his shift at 2 p.m, had the boiler been started later than 7:30. Further doubt is cast on the notion of the murder taking place at Clarke's former home, as when police conducted a thorough search of the property, including the removal of carpets to reveal the floorboards beneath, there was nothing untoward found, nor was anything discovered on the rough ground connected to the property, where it was stated that the dismemberment may have taken place. However, this was also the case at the Velva site, but in both locations the passage of 9 years could have resulted in vital evidence being lost. However, the body helped provide an indication that the dismemberment had occurred at the site due to the stones found embedded in the flesh. Therefore, if Clarke had killed Eileen at his home, he would have had to get her remains to the complex prior to dismemberment. But this involved a 16-minute journey, likely by foot, as there is no record that he drove. These aspects reduced the possibility that the murder took place at Clarke's home, but the question remained, had Eileen been there that Sunday morning? Mrs. Orr, Clarke's former neighbour, had stated that she hadn't seen anyone going to the house that day, informing her interviewers that she had been keeping a close eye on the house since December 1969, when Clarke's ex-wife had caused a disturbance, hammering on the front door and shouting that, quote, "He's got a brothel up there." The attentive neighbour refuted this allegation, with her stating that she had only ever seen the Clarke family or their babysitters going to and from the home. But even if Eileen hadn't been to the house on Anderson Street, it didn't rule out the possibility the teenager had headed straight to the Velva Liquid site, perhaps knowing that Clarke was working there that morning. But as with the house, no one saw her enter or leave the site. If the killing had occurred on the complex, Clarke would have had to clean up the scene prior to Mr. Embleton arriving at 2 p.m, all the while risking being caught by Mr. Fenwick conducting a random check-in. Yet no one noticed anything unusual around the time of Eileen's disappearance, although to be fair, it would be almost a decade before they learned anything may have happened at the site, so details may have been forgotten. The site was visible from various points. The houses and footpaths of Low Top stood in a prominent position overlooking the complex and the river beyond. River pilots watched over the Tyne constantly from a building nearby, with the Velva tanks forming part of their view, and passing vehicles either on the road or on the waterway were all able to see into the complex. But what were the chances that an individual in one of these locations on that day would remember seeing a figure on the roof of one of the tanks, or other unusual activity after 9 years? And if Clarke had been on the roof that day, would it have been deemed unusual, or would his role as an employee at the site have protected him from being eyed with suspicion? Logistically, the dismemberment and clean-up of the scene seemed the most problematic, given Clarke could have been disturbed at any time. Therefore, had he concealed the remains and returned later to finish the job? A hypothesis which would concur with the findings that there was very little blood emitted when the body was dissected, suggesting that the dismemberment had occurred sometime after death. But had it been Clarke's intention to possibly incinerate the body in the boiler at the site? Had he disposed of the legs in this manner, hence why they have never been found? Yet did he discover the rest of the remains wouldn't fit, which may explain the failed attempt to cut the torso across the breastbone, which had been noted during the autopsy. It was while conducting the post-mortem that Dr. Ranasinghe deduced that there was no indication the body had been buried for any length of time, meaning that the killer hadn't attempted to conceal the remains via that method. But this did not rule out the prospect that the perpetrator had found a well-hidden spot from which the remains were retrieved at a later stage, after which they were then dissected and deposited in the tank. But as with the jumper and the sterile evidence, all these theories did not help to conclusively prove Clarke's innocence or guilt. But there was nothing to directly link him to the crime. It still left open the prospect that the killer had not yet been identified. Was it possible it was a friend of Eileen's? Or had a stranger killed her and simply used the Velva Liquid site as a deposition point? Did that individual know the layout of the site? Or did they just get lucky with finding the hatch on Tank 1? And if it was the former, is it possible that an employee on the site lied about being associated with Eileen to protect themselves? Rough Justice took a closer look at the site and its layout, particularly how accessible it would have been to individuals other than employees. They learned that not only was the site visited by various vessels that utilised the jetty, but that it was a favoured spot for fishermen eager to take advantage of the fast-flowing current and waters which went to a depth of 40 feet, making it an ideal location for a catch. While researching this case, I discovered posts on Facebook of individuals reminiscing about spending their childhood fishing off the old jetty, with them accessing the location through a hole in a fence. Although they were trespassing, it seems it was a popular pastime. But if the jetty was that accessible, what about the rest of the site? Could it be possible that individuals were able to gain access to the tanks? Had children or teens gone there and dared one another to climb the ladders to the top of the tanks without being caught? And could this childhood escapade given the killer the knowledge of the site needed to dispose of the body into tank number 1? Or could the individual, maybe someone who had been responsible for stealing the petrol Mr. Fenwick believed Clarke had been taking, have used their familiarity with the complex for more nefarious deeds? By the time Rough Justice arrived at the complex in 1983 and spoke to a former employee regarding what security in the place was like at the time of Eileen's disappearance, it was noted that access to the jetty and the site was secured with barbed wire and robust fencing. But the employee advised that this wasn't always the case, and these additions had only been made since 1970. Continuing with the notion that a stranger could have gained access to the site, Rough Justice also considered the prospect that Eileen had died elsewhere and was brought to the location after death. They learned that beside the Velva site was once a patch of ground used as an informal car park, from which it could have been feasible to access the jetty. This posed the question, had the killer driven to the patch of land intent on disposing of the remains? Perhaps they'd already made one trip and disposed of the legs from the end of the jetty, knowing that the current would swiftly carry the remains away. But upon making a second trip, maybe the perpetrator spotted some fishermen taking advantage of the high tide, and fearing they would be seen, the killer fled into the Velva complex and used the storage tank as an alternate deposition site. This theory would explain the lack of evidence that the killing had occurred at the site, but only led to the next query: where had Eileen died instead? To explain this, the Rough Justice team attempted to discern where Eileen had been, not only on the weekend she was believed to have been killed, but for the 2 weeks she disappeared in December 1969, just a matter of weeks before her death. If they could figure out where she had been, they may find answers to several mysteries surrounding the case. Starting with the clothing that Eileen had been wearing on the Friday she returned to South Shields from Kent with her brother. When the pair arrived in the town, Eileen was wearing a red and black tweed skirt and a matching jacket. But within half an hour after separating from her brother Billy, the teenager would be seen in a different outfit, a see-through dress and a tweed coat. But where had this second set of clothes come from? It was discovered that these items had been loaned to Eileen several weeks earlier, and she had not taken them to Kent with her, suggesting they had been kept at a property in South Shields, and possibly one she had stayed at previously, perhaps when she disappeared in December. It was deemed unlikely that this could have been Clarke's house, because Elizabeth was still babysitting for him in December, with it being noted that he had purchased her and her friend Sue Sutherland a blue handbag each as a Christmas present. A police statement made by Eileen's mother on December 1969 gives some context regarding the circumstances of her daughter's disappearance that month, recalling that Eileen finished work on the 13th of December and had come home for her tea before going out to a dance. However, Eileen did not return home until the afternoon of the 14th of December. When asked where she had been, Eileen claimed she had missed the last bus after going to Latino nightclub and had gone to stay at Elizabeth's for the night. Unfortunately for the teenager, she had been caught in a lie, because her mother had been to Elizabeth's that morning and was told that Eileen hadn't been there. In a moment of frustration, Agnes ordered her daughter to pack her things and leave the house, which Eileen did, and the mother was able to provide a possible address for where her daughter may have gone. It was a property located on a housing estate approximately a mile away from the McDougall family home. This was the house of one of her daughter's friends and her parents, and it was confirmed that for 10 days in December, Eileen had resided there. The friend's father, Mr. John House, would recall that he drove the teenager and another lady on the street to their workplace, Plessy's, a major telecommunications and electronics factory behind Frederick Street in the town centre each morning. Mr. House went on to recall that the teenager was unable to pay her way, and it was discovered that she hadn't been going to work, resulting in her wages being docked. Upon learning this, the friend's father made the decision to take Eileen back to her family home, a claim that cannot be substantiated by Agnes McDougall, who could not recall the 17-year-old returning to the house that December. And it was only later that month, when Billy was on leave from the army, that Eileen was located. So where had Eileen been going instead of work? When inquiries were made at the time, no one had seen her in the town, and given that the area had received heavy snowfall, it seemed unlikely Eileen would have been walking the streets. So had she found a place to stay in the period between being thrown out of her friend's house and her brother finding her? And if so, where? There was one interesting detail that the rough justice fell upon. It was the mention of Elizabeth's address in December 1969, with it being stated as being Eastbourne Grove, a property she had moved from just before Eileen had disappeared. Therefore, the police reports in 1979 listed her new address at the time of Eileen's disappearance as Urfa Terrace. The property of Eastbourne Grove consisted of a series of flats, and had once stood within walking distance of the town centre, and well within the half-an-hour time frame Eileen needed to change her clothing between seeing her brother and meeting up with her sisters on Friday the 16th of January. But Elizabeth no longer lived there at this time, so why would Eileen have gone there unless she had become acquainted with another tenant? By 1983, however, the flats at Eastbourne Grove had been demolished, scattering the former residents across the town and beyond. But rough justice were able to track down some of the previous residents and unearthed an interesting possibility for Eileen's whereabouts, not only for December, but also for the January when she disappeared. Several tenants had recollections of the teenager visiting the flats, but not to see her sister at number 6, but instead she allegedly frequented a basement flat which had become a popular gathering place, where up to 30 individuals hung out, slept, and consumed drink and drugs. One tenant, Gail Sorensen, was interviewed by the rough justice team, remembered that everybody used to go. Everybody who was into drugs or anything. That was the only place in South Shields where people could go for a smoke. Gail went on to claim that she had seen Eileen there on occasion, sometimes accompanied by her friend Mary Bell and another girl, whose name she couldn't recall. Was this the answer to where Eileen had been staying? It fit with the idea that she was residing somewhere close to the town centre, and perhaps if the address had been checked at the time of her disappearance, witnesses may have remembered seeing her there. Although it is also possible they may not have come forward due to the illicit activities which were apparently taking place in the basement flat. While rough justice pursued this lead as a possible answer, it cannot be conclusively verified. And even if Eileen was at the flats, it does not automatically mean she was engaging in nefarious activities. It may simply have been a place for her to take shelter when she had nowhere else to go. However, one woman's memory of Eastbourne Grove speaks of the potential dangers that lurked within its walls, particularly because the lock at the main entrance to the building was broken, meaning anyone could gain entry. Speaking anonymously to the rough justice team, the woman disclosed that when she was 15 years old, she had been looking after a child for a tenant in one of the flats, when a man knocked on the door and informed her that the tenant had asked him to wait for her inside. The teenager let him in and went to settle the baby, while he started up the gas fire. As the child drifted off to sleep, the woman recalled, quote, "Hearing him walk towards me, and then I just felt a thud on my head, on the back of my head. I went down and he started kicking and punching me in the face." The woman, who was just a young girl, survived the brutal assault, yet her attacker was never brought to trial. However, rough justice would learn that the individual at the time of their investigation in 1983 was serving a life sentence for murder. Is it possible that a similar incident happened with Eileen while she was in the flats, but had her attack proved fatal? I was unable to discover when the attack on the babysitter occurred. It would be useful to know whether it fits within the timeline. The discovery of where Eileen may have been residing opened up the possibility that her murderer was also associated with the flats at Eastbourne Grove. Alongside this, the rough justice team had managed to prove that a vital piece of the prosecution's evidence, namely the jumper and Mr. Embleton's statements, were flawed, casting further doubt on the case against Clarke. Was this enough to prove his innocence? Sam Silkin QC, the former Attorney General, expressed his view that the case needed to be revisited, a recommendation he would pass on to the Home Secretary, with the seasoned judge stating he believed that the evidence proved that Clarke should be, quote, pardoned and compensated for what happened. Yet Clarke would have to wait until 1986 before he would learn if the Court of Appeal agreed with Mr. Silkin's assertions. However, prior to his hearing, the integrity of the individuals involved in the Rough Justice series would be called into question, with journalist Martin Young and Rough Justice producer Peter Hill being suspended by the BBC while an investigation was launched. The issue centred on the case of Anthony Mycock, a father of three whom the show set out to prove had been wrongly convicted of robbery. During the documentary, they spoke to Mr. Mycock's victim, Miss Anne Fitzpatrick, whose flat in Manchester he allegedly entered. Once there, he bound his victim, beat her and stole numerous items. However, while being interviewed by the Rough Justice team, Miss Fitzpatrick made the admission that she had invented the incident. Due to this, Mr. Mycock would walk free from prison. But an inquiry overseen by the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Lane, concluded that a robbery had occurred, and it was suggested that Peter Hall and Martin Young had allegedly used thinly veiled threats towards Miss Fitzpatrick, which included them exposing her lesbian tendencies if she did not admit that her testimony against Mycock was false. Any suggestion of impropriety on the part of the Rough Justice team was vehemently denied by BBC Managing Director Bill Cotton. However, both Martin Young and Peter Hall were placed on a 3-month unpaid suspension, and they were barred from being involved in any BBC investigative journalism for 2 years. With this scandal occurring within weeks of Clarke's appeal, it had the potential to cast doubt on the findings of the Rough Justice team, whose 1983 documentary would be viewed by the men who would decide whether Clarke should be freed. The prosecutor, Mr. Brian Walsh QC, would argue that despite the new evidence, the case against Clarke remained safe and satisfactory, adding that the jumper and Mr. Embleton's testimony was never a major suit. He would proceed to contend that, quote, the Crown's case at the beginning and at the end rested upon the assertion to the jury that there were certain irresistible inferences to be drawn from the evidence. These irresistible inferences came from evidence that had nothing to do with Ronald Embleton or what was found under Tank 4. Brian Walsh went on to outline these inferences as follows. Eileen knew her killer. The killer had been an employee of Velvet Liquids. Giving them the opportunity to be at the site alone, and they were confident that they would have substantial periods of time where they would be uninterrupted. The killer had been strong and agile, however they had limited experience in using a knife. Mr. Walsh also agreed with Judge Lord Justice Lawton's suggestion that the body was likely placed in the tank under the cover of darkness. It was implied by the prosecution that the killing had been sexually motivated, going on to claim that Eileen had been, quote, a mischievous girl who had run away from home on 4 occasions. She was also sexually active and had been described as a tease. The implication of these traits, according to the prosecution, was that someone may have become upset when she rejected their advances. Mr. Walsh suggested that this had been the case with Clarke, who he claimed had lost his temper and struck Eileen as she walked away from him. In concluding his argument, the prosecutor conceded that the jumper and Mr. Embleton's evidence was no longer relevant to the case, but he added, quote, by the time that the police went to see this man, there was an overwhelming, irresistible case the killer of Eileen McDougall could not be anyone other than the defendant. Not one shred or iota of it depended anywhere on anything that Mr. Embleton said or upon the existence of the jumper. Whilst the case was being debated in the court, there were numerous individuals who came forward to express their own doubts regarding the conviction. This included Mr. William Duffy, the South Tyneside coroner, and MP Dr. David Clarke, who had spent years campaigning to have the case reviewed. It seemed that Ernie Clarke had garnered some high-profile supporters, but ultimately the decision would lie in the hands of the 3 appeal judges. And on Wednesday the 5th of February 1986, it was announced that, having considered all the new evidence, Clarke's conviction should be upheld, with them concluding that, quote, it was beyond reason anybody other than Clarke could have killed and dismembered the victim. The decision was likely reassuring for Eileen's family, knowing that the man found guilty of her murder would remain in prison. But on the other side of the coin was Clarke's family, his children, whose lives had also been torn apart. Following their father's arrest, the 3 young siblings had been separated by the care system. Their bond only rekindled when they reached adulthood, but their surety of their father's innocence never wavered. His daughter, Debbie Clarke, spoke to the Daily Mail after the failed appeal, expressing the impact the decision had on her father and his family, stating, he has wept a lot in his cell, but these last few months he's been so happy to think he would be coming home to us. Now he has lost his last chance. I think he will just age very quickly. We thought it would be a new life for us, but now that's gone. Despite losing his appeal and remaining in prison, Clarke still managed to find love via a pen friend who had once been his neighbour in South Shields. Mary Sands, who first became acquainted with Clarke in 1966, began writing to him while he was in HMP Franklin, with it being claimed by his daughter Becky that Mary's letters had given her father hope in his darkest moments. And in July 1986, it was announced that the couple, who had corresponded with each other for a year, were to be married. This news was in conjunction with Mary speaking to the press, to whom she recalled her surprise when she learned Clarke had been accused of murder, stating, I was absolutely devastated, but I knew that he could not have done it. He's not that kind of man. She added, as far as I am concerned, he is not a murderer. He is the same man I knew 21 years ago, honest and upright. He is paying a debt to society for a crime he did not commit. The following month the pair would be married at Durham Registry Office, with their nuptials witnessed by 8 guests. The couple were then escorted in separate vehicles to HMP Franklin, where the marriage was blessed by Chaplain Reverend Mike Dixon, after which the new Mr. and Mrs. Clarke were permitted to have some time in the visitors' room, under the watchful gaze of prison guards, before he was led off to his cell, and the new Mrs. Clarke left the prison, married but alone. However, tying the knot seemed to be a decision she had no hesitation in making, with her telling the press, "I love him, and I'm willing to stand by him no matter how long he's got to wait until he gets out." While Clarke's family and his new wife stood by him, there were others who believed he deserved to stay in prison. With one caller to Metro Radio's Night Owls phone-in programme alleging that, as a former police officer, Eileen McDougall's murder inquiry was, quote, "the worst experience of my life." The man, who chose to go by the name Dave, informed the radio host, Alan Robson, that he had interacted with Clarke while he was in the cells at South Shields police station, and remembered the suspect as being, quote, "just so non compos mentis. He gave me a tip for a horse." Dave went on to argue that the circumstantial evidence against Clarke was overwhelming, before going on to disparage the Rough Justice documentary, stating, "It is totally wrong that people have the wrong impression on this. Rough Justice, it's just muck." Clarke's sentence was totally justified. He should be kept in for life. I just feel sorry for the McDougall family. The circumstantial evidence was so strong, he had to be convicted. He did it. Ernie Clarke would remain in prison for the time being, and life in South Shields moved on, with old making way for new, which included the tanks of Velva liquids, with it being announced that the site was to be cleared and new housing would be constructed in the form of flats, which still stand today. By 1987, Ernie Clarke had returned to Wakefield Prison, and his campaign for freedom had been taken to the European Court of Human Rights, who would decree that he would, as long as the stipulations are met, be granted the right to be released on licence in the year 1991, meaning he could have been released 10 years after his conviction. However, in 1993 it was revealed by Shields Daily Gazette that although Clarke was still in prison, he had been given a Category D status, permitting him to reside in an open prison, and he had been allowed to make unescorted train journeys to visit his wife and family in Tyneside. It was stated by the prison authorities that Clarke had proven himself to be a model prisoner, and there were suggestions that his placement in the open prison, combined with the unaccompanied trips, were signs that he may soon be released. It was a prospect which moved a step closer in June 1994, when the Shields Daily Gazette exclusively revealed that the Home Secretary, Michael Howard, was considering granting parole to the now 63-year-old Clarke. The Home Secretary's decision was made public in November 1994, with it being stated that the parole board had been pleased with the behaviour the prisoner had demonstrated while incarcerated. They also took into consideration that the ageing inmate was showing signs of physical deterioration. He was at that time the oldest inmate being held at the Lindholm prison, and his chronic angina and a serious respiratory disorder had been taken into account when considering the possible risk he could pose to the public. The Shields Gazette interviewed a Lindholm prison spokesman regarding the decision to release Clarke, with them informing the paper, "Clarke is the longest lifer we have here. He is now a very frail old man. His good behaviour and poor health have been major factors in the parole board agreeing to consider a provisional early release. He will probably be released to live in a hostel somewhere close to his family." In December 1994, the parole board would relax the provision that Clarke reside in a hostel, partially due to the fact that, given the profile of the case, many owners had refused to accommodate him through fear of retaliation. Therefore, they granted the ailing man the permission to reside with his wife Mary, with whom he would spend his first Christmas in 15 years as a free man. In March 1996, Julie Cush, a reporter for the Shields Daily Gazette, was able to interview Clarke 2 years after his release. She learned that he had tried to maintain a low profile, living a quiet, unassuming life, where his only flurry of excitement was brought on when his horse wins at the races. Julie Cush remarked on her article that although Clarke was suffering from diabetes, he seemed otherwise to be in good health, something he attributed to the care he was receiving from a quartet of doctors. He would express his gratitude for this, while also stating, "I can't forget that 15 years has been taken off me for a crime that I did not commit." This assertion was following an earlier claim that there was not a single shred of evidence. "I'll fight until the day I die to clear my name." While he lamented his lost years, Clarke also spoke of the joys of being able to spend time with his now adult children and his grandchildren, one of whom he frequently visited in South Shields, where the boy and his mother resided. However, it seems Clarke did not get to enjoy his freedom for very long, with some reports claiming that he passed away sometime in the year 2000 or 2001, meaning he only had 6 years outside the prison walls. While Clarke was able to enjoy some time with his family, seeing his wife without being divided by perspex glass, reconnect with his children and grandchildren, these were events that were all denied to 17-year-old Eileen McDougall, who would never fall in love and be married. She wouldn't bear children, or garner delight in watching over her own grandchildren. In these episodes, I may have spent a long time focusing on the debate as to whether Clarke was guilty or not. But I'm also mindful that through every hearing and appeal, Eileen's loved ones suffered. Her sister Elizabeth's character was besmirched. Agnes and William had their ability as parents questioned, with William also being described as a violent drunk. Meanwhile, Eileen, a 17-year-old girl, who may not have made the best choices in her short life, was judged for her actions, with it seeming as though the narrative centred on her being promiscuous, and it was this behaviour that resulted in her death because she rejected someone's advances. It breaks my heart when I see victims portrayed like this. Eileen was young, she was still figuring out her place in the world, and was simply living her life. She had every right to say no to unwanted attention without fear of consequences. Thank you for listening to It's Murder Up North. Over the next couple of episodes, I shall divert away from the Wakefield series, as I delve into a number of cases I came across while researching Eileen McDougall's murder. These cases all occurred in 1974 in the Tyneside area, and I shall start with the death of 8-year-old Julia Brown.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.